absolutely nothing! You ass biter!
Tetris, the Soviet mind game, released in 1988 for the Nintendo Entertainment System by Tengen, or Tengen as it's supposed to be pronounced, or so I'm told, but I'm not going to bother because, you know, old habits and all, was the first version of Tetris that I have ever played. Now you notice the shape of the game pack, which is quite different than the usual NES game pack, and that's because Tengen Tetris was an unlicensed cartridge and a source of contention in a series of court battles between parent company Atari Games and Nintendo. But that's a story best told by gaming historians and such, or maybe they could make a movie out of this too. Long story short, Nintendo won the case, Tengen stopped making NES games, which makes this version fairly uncommon these days. Despite this, Tengen's Tetris is a common title on a multitude of NES and Famicom multi-cart things, often identified as Tetris 2, which is not to be confused with the actual Tetris 2 that would come along later down the road, but also not to be confused with the other Tetris 2 that was only released in Japan and came with Bombliss. Don't worry, none of this shit matters in the long run. Atari Games previously produced an arcade version of Tetris that we looked at years ago in a previous video, and Tengen Tetris is only loosely based on that game in that it shares some musical bits and graphics, but is more like a traditional marathon game where every 30 or 50 lines cleared moves you up a level and the speed increases. But most notably, Tengen Tetris is the only traditional NES Tetris to feature a two-player mode, whether it be a competitive or cooperative mode, which is a peculiar experience in the latter case. We're not counting Tetris 2 in this regard because that's a different beast entirely, and we're also not counting Tetris 2 and Bombliss because that was only available in Japan. I feel I shouldn't have to mention that last point, but you know, it's the Twitter age and people are fucking stupid. But I digress. Anyway, for those who have never played Tetris, try to keep up. But you fit in blocks in gaps to create lines which go bye-bye, and you keep doing this until the game ends, which can occur when you top out by filling past a certain point or something. And it's a perfectly fine take on Tetris, essentially the building blocks for the classic Tetris game. This version drops the hard drop of the previous game and replaces it with the soft drop, which basically increases the speed of your block's descent whenever you hold down, allowing for more control. You also have the ability to rotate clockwise and counter with the A and B buttons, which open a universe of possibility and strategy. It seems ridiculous to make a big deal out of that, considering it's sort of a common thing nowadays in Tetris games, but back in the day, going from what you had before to that had to seem like a big deal to the people who went in that direction. As before, you can choose your starting stage, which determines the drop speed of your tetrominoes, as well as the height of gaming garbage to clear away. After clearing 30 or 50 lines later, you'll get a score tally while a Russian troupe performs a little dance number for you. The better you perform, the more dancers come out to perform, and then you continue where you left off, unlike the previous game where clearing a stage resets the board with a relatively clean slate. Over the years, I've come to learn that people tend to gravitate towards Tengen Tetris due to its multiplayer options or maybe the style of presentation, and there will be more argument that it's perhaps the most feature-filled take of the NES fare. Competitive modes against a second player or even against the computer is always fun for a lark, but the cooperative mode is the more intriguing bit, where you and a buddy are both controlling falling tetrominoes in this single well. That requires a good sense of teamwork and is naturally best played with a buddy because the computer tries, but it's not always the best partner and will often go out of its way to try and fuck you over. I also like that while you're both working together, you also have separate line counters, which is wonderful. Tengen Tetris controls fine for the most part and manages that fine balance where it doesn't feel too stiff nor do the blocks move too loosely. That said, I tend to prefer the feel of the later Nintendo version. This one doesn't feel quite as smooth. I think it's the soft drop where you hold down and there's a bit of a delay before it eventually starts to move faster. That usually kind of threw me off a bit, but other than that, it's still pretty solid regardless. One thing to note is that when you pause, the gameplay freezes in place and doesn't cause the screen to black out or get replaced with a message telling you to press start. And I do appreciate that. It's a minor thing, but it's something I appreciate because that always confounded me for some reason. As stated before, Tengen Tetris is largely based on Atari games Arcade Tetris, sharing much of the visual assets and style of that game but in a somewhat lesser form. The falling tetrominoes have duller colors, and when they land, they turn into a single color, depending on the current stage, which I thought was an odd but interesting effect. The main layout is simple and clean looking, with the second player slot occupied with a screen showing the number of dropped pieces in single player games. I don't know why they chose to represent this with a graph format, but I'd imagine it serves some use to somebody who wants to make a gag in a video somewhere down the line.
You ass biter!
I also like the line clearing effect in this version, but don't care for the random numbers that pop up on the side when you land a piece, mostly because they're usually hard to make out. Tengen Tetris' musical selection comprised a number of Russian folk tunes, a couple that were also featured in the Famicom Tetris game as well as the Atari arcade game. The tunes are simple yet catchy little melodies that fit in nicely with the overall Russian theme. The sound effects are rather low-key. No noise when you rotate the pieces, a soft thump when they settle in, and a creaking noise when you clear the lines. For some reason, I kind of like that sound design in a Tetris game. Don't know why, it's just a weird thing that appeals to me, for some reason.